Lecture 26, we call it the Wilsonian Moment. This is in reference to Woodrow Wilson and the Versailles Treaty, or the Paris Peace Conference, that ended World War I and redrew the boundaries of Europe. A couple of themes we need to keep in mind here. Self-determination is the key term here in this lecture. Another theme to think about is how we can internationalize U.S. history. This lecture is taken from an excellent book that I read last year. The author is Ares Manella. The book is called The Wilsonian Moment, Self-Determination, and the International Origins of Anti-Colonial Nationalism. That's a mouthful. I'm going to quote here from Manella's introduction. He says, "This book is an effort to reconstruct the story of the colonial world at the Wilsonian moment. Most historians have told the story of the Paris Peace Conference from the inside out, focusing on the views and actions of the leaders of the great powers of Europe and North America. This book aims to tell it from the outside in, from the perspective of peoples who were on the margins of the Peace Conference and of international society more generally. The book itself focuses on the experiences of four distinct national groups: the Egyptians, the Indians, the Chinese, and the Koreans. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these four groups. Instead, what I want to do is to take a sort of a broad and general view of this Wilsonian moment to determine why it was significant. So let's characterize President Wilson's 14 points and this idea of self-determination. The United States emerged from the Great War, World War I, with enhanced power, both economically, politically, and militarily. The Great War had set the stage for expectations for radical changes around the world. The Great War had also dealt a severe blow to the power and prestige of the traditional European powers. The core, in other words. This made it easier for the colonial national groups to rise up against them and to challenge them. The Great War strained the resources of the European powers, exposed as hollow their claims to a superior civilization. It also decimated the image of Western military invincibility. This had already been tarnished by the Russian defeat at the hands of the Japanese a few years earlier in 1905. Peripheral countries also made significant contributions to the Allied war effort, and they felt this entitled them to a voice in their own government. If people from the periphery could die alongside Europeans, why shouldn't they not be able to govern themselves like Europeans? The Paris Peace Conference would create the Versailles Treaty. This, of course, would redraw the boundaries of Europe. President Wilson arrives at Versailles with enormous support and power. It is widely expected that Wilson is poised to lead the world into a new era of international relations. The president's 14 points seem to promise national groups the right of self-governance. So you can smell trouble coming here. Wilson has proclaimed self-governance, self-determination as a sort of universal right, and people take him seriously. This is going to have tragic consequences. The Paris Peace Conference is widely viewed as an historic opportunity for these colonial societies to shake off their imperial masters and to take a seat of equality among the community of nations. A growing consensus has emerged here that self-governing nation-state was the only legitimate political form across the globe. The Wilsonian moment, then, should be understood as an international, worldwide phenomenon because the president's rhetoric fired the aspirations of millions of colonized people. I quote again from Manella's book, quote, "The most crucial feature of Wilson's speeches was that they came from a man widely viewed as the most powerful leader in the world, whose influence on the international order, it was assumed, would be decisive. For a time in 1918 and early 1919, Wilson, who appeared to wield extraordinary leverage over the Allies and enjoyed unprecedented popularity among other peoples, seemed to possess both the will and the power to implement his vision. So let's talk about this vision, self-determination. Wilson wasn't the first one to come up with this. The British Prime Minister had talked about it. The revolutionaries in Russia, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, leaders of the Russian Revolution, they had talked about it. Of course, Lenin and Trotsky used self-determination as a wrecking ball against the imperial powers, against the industrial core. Wilson, here's a quote, "We believe that every people have the right to choose the sovereignty under which they shall live, and that the small states of the world shall enjoy the same respect for their sovereignty and for their territorial integrity." The problem, of course, is that Wilson meant this only for Europeans. He did not mean it for Chinese, Indians, Koreans, Vietnamese, and Egyptians, among other colonized people. Wilson, of course, viewed self-determination as a way of beating back revolutionary challenges to the existing order, like Lenin and Trotsky in the Russian Revolution. Self-determination appeared to be the quote-unquote silver lining, or the light at the end of the tunnel. You can pick your cliche here. It appeared to be this light at the end of the tunnel as World War I comes to an end. Perhaps something promising, something positive will come out of this carnage. That would be self-determination around the world. Wilson's language was adopted by groups that made claims directed at the victorious powers at Versailles. The Irish, for instance, asked for their independence from Great Britain, and of course Great Britain had no intentions of doing this. Even in the United States, African-American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois demanded the dignity of self-determination for American blacks. Self-determination seemed a privilege only for the core. And this, of course, is the problem. Due to Wilson's rhetoric, was self-determination now become available to all? Think about the European nationalities that are no longer going to be under the thumb of the great empires that had been destroyed in the First World War. The Finns, the Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Serbians, Hungarians, Austrians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. All these distinct ethnic groups are now going to be formed into their own countries. They're not going to be under the thumb of the Germans or the Habsburgs or the Russians. This is self-determination in action, but you'll notice it only takes place in Europe. Other nationalities seeking full sovereignty, Chinese, Indians, Koreans, Egyptians, Arabs, Jews, Armenians, Kurds. So you can see the trouble coming here. And of course, many of these people are still looking for, I'm thinking of the Kurds in particular. There is no Kurdistan. The problem, of course, is that there are Kurds living in Iraq, in Turkey, in Armenia, and in Iran. So therefore, to form a Kurdistan so that the Kurds could have self-determination, you'd have to take territory from 4 different nations, and they are not willing to give this territory up. Let's take a closer look at Wilson here and see if we should be surprised at his attitude. Wilson is a Southern racist, just to be blunt. He saw non-whites as backward and uncivilized. Wilson believed that with proper instruction, non-whites could eventually learn the habits of civilization, including self-government, but they would have to be tutored by their betters. Wilson never challenged the racial assumptions of his Southern upbringing. In fact, he showed the sort of classic silent film, early film, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. He showed it many times in the White House. You can YouTube this on your own and take a look. It's a film that exalts the KKK during Reconstruction after the Civil War and portrays African Americans in the most vile stereotypes you can imagine. Let's go to the periphery and look at some of these people who are taking Wilson's rhetoric seriously, and then who will be disappointed and will take different paths in the 20th century. The Indian National Congress remained moderate towards Great Britain during the Great War. Afterwards, the Congress began to lead the fight for Indian independence. The newfound radicalism of the Congress was led by Mahatma Gandhi. You guys have heard of Gandhi. This lasted until 1947, when the British finally did leave India. The Indian leader, Nehru, said, quote, "Much was expected of the war. It was to have revolutionized the fabric of human affairs, but it has ended without bringing any solace or hope of permanent peace or betterment." President Wilson's brave words have remained only words. And the 14 points, where are they? Nehru again, he says, quote, "The brief day of European domination is already approaching its end. The future lies with America and Asia. India today is part of that world movement." And then, of course, in China, Sun Yat-sen, who is the sort of icon of Chinese nationalism in the early part of the century, he viewed self-determination within a broad global context. Quote, "Wilson's proposals, once set forth, could not be recalled. Each one of the weaker, smaller nations, stirred with a great new consciousness, they saw how completely they had been deceived by the great powers' advocacy of self-determination, and they began independently and separately to carry out the principle of self-determination on their own." In China, the so-called May 4th protest erupted in response to Chinese disillusion with the broken Wilsonian promise of self-determination. And of course, when Mao Zedong, the head of the victorious Chinese Communist Party, announced in 1949 that the Chinese people had, quote, "stood up, finally," he declared the attainment of the goal that the Chinese nationalists had been pursuing for the better part of a century, self-determination. Wilson probably never saw a petition from a Vietnamese leader while he was at the Paris Peace Conference. Certainly he did not respond to it if he did see it. That Vietnamese leader would later be known to the world as Ho Chi Minh, who would lead the Vietnamese Revolution and then the war against both the French, the Japanese, and then finally the Americans. Ho Chi Minh turned away from the Western path and adopted communism as his new creed. For Ho Chi Minh, Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, replaced Wilson as his inspiration on the road to self-determination for the Vietnamese people. In Korea, the March 1st movement, which began as an effort to draw the attention of Wilson and the Peace Conference to Koreans' claims for independence. This movement began to escalate now and began to resist Japanese colonizers. The people of Korea wished to be included in that process, to become part of the family of nations. When Wilson died in 1924, an Egyptian intellectual recalled, quote, "We all know Dr. Wilson. We all remember the time when we gazed at the 14 points in awe. We all remember the great hopes built upon those principles, hopes which still grip the world." Then, of course, later in 1958, when tensions between the United States and a newly assertive Egypt were at a peak, the Egyptian president, Nasser, who was born, oddly enough, or coincidentally, on January 15, 1918, exactly 1 week after Wilson's 14 points were announced, Nasser accused the United States of forgetting, quote, "the principles invoked by Wilson, the principles of self-determination." So these peripheral colonized countries were neither naive victims of Wilson's hypocrisy, nor, outside of a few exceptions, were they radicals intent on revolutionary transformation. Rather, these were savvy politicians who were keenly aware of their weaknesses vis-a-vis the British Empire or the Japanese, and they sought to harness Wilson's power and rhetoric in the struggle to achieve international recognition and equality for their nations. So let's conclude here with some significances. China, India, Korea, Vietnam, Egypt, among other nations, lost faith and the sort of Western path to modernity. In the spring of 1919, sweeping protest movements against imperialism erupted simultaneously in all these societies. Some, like China and Vietnam, turned to an alternative, communist path. Korea, of course, would be overrun by the Japanese, then divided during the Cold War, a division that persists unto this day. Disappointment in the failure to follow through with the Wilsonian promise of self-determination provoked increased nationalism in these colonized countries. Wilson's speech may be the first substantial or penetrating critique of European imperialism by a Westerner. Wilson had, I guess to use another cliche, had sort of opened Pandora's box here, or he sort of let the genie out of the lamp. Once out, you can't recapture it. I remember during the Watergate crisis years ago, Bob Haldeman told John Dean, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's hard to put it back in. And that's kind of the story here. Wilson's rhetoric was taken seriously. The nationalism that would be fomented here is going to lead to independence movements, revolutions, wars of independence. Just think about the Vietnamese again. Thinking about the Wilsonian moment in the colonial world also provides us with an unusual perspective on the history of decolonization and anti-colonialism. At the Wilsonian moment, all these peripheral peoples glimpsed the promised land of self-determination, but they could not enter into it, at least not yet. Wilson himself, on the way to Paris, seemed to have an epiphany and some understanding of the impact of this idea of self-determination that he had put out there. He said, quote, "You know and I know that these ancient wrongs and the present unhappiness is not to be remedied in a day or with a wave of a hand. What I seem to see, and with all my heart I hope that I'm wrong, is a tragedy of disappointment across the world." He's right about that. All these factors, I think, tend to negate the charges that the Wilsonian moment is too Eurocentric to belong in a world history course, because clearly the Wilson's rhetoric reverberated around the world and had dramatic impacts, some of which we're still living with. So I'll close there. Thank you.